Happy March, everyone! The start of another month means another Revolution patch to go over, and this month marks a historic change to the patch cadence of Revolution rotations moving forward. So let's get into it. As always, there are key links in the description below for your resources to check out all things Revolution Custom Standard, such as the Custom Magic Discord server where you can get updates about and play the format against others, as well as check out all of the cool cards and sets that other players in the community are designing. The Revolution Compendium, where you can look through all of the cards the curators recommend for consideration in your decks, sorted by card roles. And Manifesto, our dedicated Scryfall-like search engine that lets you search through cards from sets currently in the format. This month marks a major turning point in the balanced patch schedule. Previously, third month patch notes in any given season would typically just consist of more updates to rein in problematic archetypes and strategies, which oft coincided with lower attendance numbers in third month GPs. To combat this anticipated drop in player count, and to help bolster sets that have existed in the format for a while, Month 3 patches will now feature buffs to cards that have been in the Revolution field for at least a year. We'll get into those buffs and what they mean for the format at large in a little bit, but for now we should start off with talking about ban list changes and nerfs. The February balance window brought about two major bans to powerful sacrifice tools from Cyberos, with General Diadem Usurper being banned as part of the initial monthly patch, and Extraction Ritual catching a pre-GP ban after some discussion and testing in the post-Berry nerf environment with cards like Devoted Lackeys. As March begins, we're receiving an unban to General Diadem, although it is coming in conjunction with a nerf to that sacrifice mode that we'll cover next. As for Extraction Ritual, it sounds as though there currently aren't plans to readjust the card, so it will remain banned until we're told otherwise. In order for Diadem to be deemed safe for the format, that free instant speed sack outlet ability was due for a change, as that was the primary use case that it caused original concern with cards like the Berry Master. Diadem has now been updated to cost 1 mana to sacrifice any non-land permanent, so long as it isn't a knight. Diadem hadn't really seen much competitive play prior to GQ Chaos Reigns, and while the broader network of permanents you can feed into the outlet is nice, the mana tax does hurt its viability a bit. The most intriguing avenue to me here, though, is not to use Diadem as a pure sacrifice engine, and not with a bunch of trinket junk permanents like berries, but rather in conjunction with cards you'd already want to play, like the Omens or sagas like the Fall of Trax, which you could sacrifice in response to their final chapter ability. I think the combo plan for Diadem is largely off the table for now, but the mid-range value presented here could be interesting in the right shell. I'll definitely be considering this alongside contest coordinator shells, such as White-Black Colorless. After some experimentation in month 1, Relentless Bats exploded onto the GP scene in February with a blue-black Bats deck leveraging fast mill and anthem effects like Kimis Central Intelligence to swing for a ton of damage out of nowhere. The speed and resilience of this strategy was owed in large part to the free surface cost of the bats as long as you had one in play, which is receiving a knock this patch. Now, that surface cost reduction will require 1 mana to cast each bat, making the strategy far slower, though that mana will be of any color. I'm sure the plan can still exist and thrive with the bats, but it won't be as breakneck as it was before. Maybe some aristocrats style deck could benefit from the high availability of 1 mana creatures from the graveyard, but don't count me as too excited, especially with the free sacrifice outlets having largely been hurt in the last few months. Also contributing to the speed of bats was Laystone of Ruin, which threatens to rapidly fill your graveyard if played on turn 1, and started to polarize mulligans as a result. To curb this, Laystone is now being relegated to primarily an offensive mill tool, as the first turn/discard clause is now restricted to targeting an opponent. I don't think traditional mill is all that well positioned right now, but there are a fair few decks that do get greedy enough to dig deep into their libraries, as well as strategies with slower kill conditions. So if a mill deck can find the right balance of anti-aggro tools and anti-control disruption, maybe traditional mill could still put this to use and have a resurgence. Illustrious Shengfa is receiving a sweeping change following its overwhelming dominance, with 4 of the top 6 decks in last month's GP being on at least a few copies. Shengfa resulted in a difficult judge call during the Swiss portion of the tournament due to his on-cast trigger saying target player instead of target opponent, meaning when you skipped over the trigger, it could be argued to be unclear despite the correct target being the opponent in nearly every case, and therefore be ruled as a missed trigger, causing some potential skewing of game states. To combat this trigger confusion, make Shengfa more interactable on the stack and board, and fix some timing mistakes caused by the delays on his other activated abilities. His cast trigger is now a static Arcane Laboratory-like effect, which locks the opponent to one spell per turn, and his second and third loyalty abilities have also been reworked. His 0 is now a -X, getting a permanent with mana value X back from your graveyard to play immediately instead of getting it at your next turn's end step. And his -3 is now a -4, giving you the option to destroy all creatures if you had one upon activating, and now offering to blow up artifacts and enchantments as well. To compensate for these shifts, Shengfa is gaining an additional starting loyalty. All in all, Shengfa seems poised to thrive all the same, but with some new vulnerabilities against very fast aggressive decks to make up for the gained immediacy of his abilities, and hopefully with far fewer judge calls in the future. Sifting Through Soot has caused some problems due to its final ability previously being instant speed and repeatable, making for boards that could be tricky to punch through in longer games. These issues have both been addressed, with the reanimation ability on Sifting now sorcery speed locked, and requiring you to sacrifice it in order to activate the ability. I think this card's still really solid, a good sideboard tool against aggressive decks, and hey, if you're playing it with a Yeji shell, can just be something you can get back with Yeji once you sacrifice. But if you're looking to hold up a bunch of mana, Sifting Through Soot's sorcery clause on that last ability is going to be felt. Chronicle of Awakening also made a huge splash last GP in the hands of Philippe Sanner, who built a black-green ramp deck using Chronicle in conjunction with Cryptolabe and the best mana dorks in the field to rush this or Chronicle Extinction out, and then race towards the flashback cost. On the front side, you could blow up a troublesome enchantment or artifact, or even planeswalker, slip a Skotha into play to untap all of your lands and rip apart your opponent's hand, or even take out one of your opponent's lands, and upon flashing it back, Chronicle could reliably place the opponent under a tough mana disadvantage by picking off 3 lands at once, which is especially brutal in conjunction with the deck's inclusion of Vorpal Titans to destroy all non-basic lands. To bring Chronicle of Awakening more in line with canon equivalents of these sorts of creature cheat effects and hinder its from-hand power a bit, it's now 6 mana for its initial casting cost, though I think the Chronicle's plane will still be able to put it to some degree of use. These last 2 big nerfs are less out-and-out nerfs and more so a part of the balance wave coming to rework cards from older sets. Benthelos had a pretty successful month in February as part of the base white control shell popularized by Zangi back in January, and is catching a change to how he copies enchantments this month. Now, rather than letting you pay mana for a delayed token creation trigger, you cast a copy of the chosen enchantment, allowing you to leverage cost reduction triggers like Keranos and on-cast triggers like Aphara, as well as circumventing the lost mana you would have spent if your opponent would remove the target in response. But this is all at the cost of exposing yourself to further on-stack interaction. Considering this means Benthelos now dodges the most popular sideboard hate of choice for his shenanigans in Looming Psyhawk, which was also good against the deck's inclusion of Shengfa, as casting a copy of an enchantment isn't creating a token, I think the additional exposure to counter magic is a very small price to pay for a huge buff hiding as a nerf. Benthelos can't keep getting away with this. This card is still so good. Also receiving a nerf of sorts is the Founding of the 12, which was originally intended as a parallel to the Burning of Pide. The modal component had started to pivot away from the original design seed as it picked up the Scry mode in its last nerf, while going up to 3 mana from 2, so it's instead going to always make a token and mill a player for 2. This seems worse for an all-in mill deck, self-mill or offensive mill, but it does mean that the card can now contribute to a graveyard-centric game plan while not letting the board get away from you. If you're looking to take a more controlling graveyard strategy into the field and keep up with the board state, Founding could help you do both. Finally, though not really a nerf, this change helps us seg into our buffs, so it's a solid place to start. Snoring Stone has been removed from the Chikyu Chaos Reign set and replaced with Pest Problem, a white-shifted version of the canon card Fade from History. Fade hasn't been too popular in official standard to my knowledge, being largely relegated to a seldom-seen sideboard tool, so I'm not sure how Pest Problem will be too important. However, with a smaller card pool than official standard, and with so many artifact and enchantment synergies running around right now, Pest Problem could have a chance to shine. Notably, it takes away artifacts and enchantments without you needing to have one in play, whereas the next best option in white, Shengfa, does require you to have an artifact and an enchantment in play if you want to blow up both. Also, that costs 2 more mana. Say your goodbyes to Snoring Stone, though, because we will not be getting to play with that card anymore, though it didn't really see a whole lot of play to begin with. As mentioned, this month marks the start of a new component to our annual season patch schedule. While normally this would only bring with it the updates for the set entering its 15th month in the field, in this case, Awakening and Uldun, the two sets that predate Uldun, those being Hyperpop and Theros Age of Tracks, are also getting an opportunity to tune up some of their aimed-at constructed pieces that never quite made it. Pest Problem is a nice lead into the first chunk of major changes, which are aimed at providing a wider diversity of sideboard tools, primarily for white and red. For instance, Alrant and Eagle Eye, which had previously been an underperforming piece for heroic and go-wide strategies, has been reworked into Alrant and Archon, a card built to punish artifact spam and non-basic lands. I don't think the Archon is particularly astonishing, but it's a good stat line for the very easy cost, and there are definitely matchups where it looks great. I think Archon suffers most from being introduced 2 months too late, as its best prey in berries was really cut down after January. If something like the Berry Master ever creeps into popularity, though, Archon will be a nice tool to keep it in check, but for the time being, my hopes aren't all that high. Red has received a host of new sideboard tools in this patch, with the first change coming to Electes' Charge, taking the first chapter ability from A God Divided to now hit non-enchantment creatures rather than creatures that aren't enchanted. This helps broaden its utility and make it available to decks leaning on the enchantment creature suite from Theros Age of Tracks better, making it a solid one-sided sweeper for those aggressive decks leaning on those creatures to bring in against other aggro matchups. Rather than exchanging its first chapter ability with Electes' Charge's sweeper mode, A God Divided is actually receiving a complete overhaul to its first 2 chapters. Now, it can destroy as many artifacts as you'd like on enter, so long as they collectively amount to 4 or less mana value, providing Red a solid answer to artifact token spam akin to Hungry Blob. The second mode has also been swapped out to a rummaging mode, making it more useful outside of go-wide strategies. The final mode is largely unchanged, which admittedly seems a mediocre finale for the saga as it is now, and not something I expect to be too relevant most of the time, but it can secure a kill through a gummed up board if your opponent is low enough. The Artifact Hate isn't quite done yet, though, as Cliffside Line Dancers has also received a rework from being a haste-enabling engine to an artifact removal creature that can be wandered for repeat value. I am afraid Scrappers is just a tad too outclassed at the moment, and with things like Crux hailing from the same set, I'm not really sure Scrapper will ever have a window to thrive, but it's certainly an option now. Finally, in our sideboard upgrading suite is Flame Whip, which is replacing the cannon removal spell Flame Lash as a cheap way for Red to burn out a creature or planeswalker. It's a solid check to things that move beyond the usual 3 toughness breakpoint, but not so much that I'm too confident it will see much play. It's good for controlling lists, but tools like Crux provide Red a means to punch above 3 damage on permanents anyhow, so I'm really not sure what decks will want this. Also worth noting, Flame Whip was shifted to an uncommon, which pushed Life Begins Anew down to common. Mono Red Burn was an all-star the last time we had a Pauper Eternal tournament, and one of the best creatures in that deck was a cheap red 1-mana 1/1 favor creature from TRX that could become legendary at the start of combat. So perhaps Life Begins Anew could see some experimentation there when we revisit Pauper. Moving on to changes aimed at main decks, we'll go set by set, starting with the oldest currently in the field, Hyperpop. Sphinx of the Sound Veins is receiving a slight power increase, moving from a 3/4 to a 4/4. This actually significantly improves Sphinx's lethality, as it moves from a 7-turn clock down to a 5-turn clock on its lonesome, while also making it a better participant in creature combat. My biggest concern with Sphinx is that the best decks for such a cheap potential big flyer are ones that want to push onto the board with cheap tempo creatures already, and playing a creature on a prior turn makes the whole premise of the Sphinx offline. However, this could still be a solid tool for disruptive tempo decks by allowing you to spend the second and third turns of the game holding up counter magic, and then on turn 4 being able to deploy a considerable threat while still being able to hold up a 2 or 3 mana counterspell. Light Vein Purifier is having the mana cost taken off of its activated ability, allowing it to cash in lands for damage, life gain, and card draw without taking too severe of a hit to your currently available mana. Purifier is awkward in slower decks, as Control often struggles to operate from a mana deficit, but one place I could see Purifier making waves in is Seal Shoals decks, as Purifier is now a free activated ability for Shoals. Even better, Purifier can be activated on your opponent's end step when you're tapped out to animate a land and help meet Shoals' condition with the trigger on the stack. and then untap on your turn with the animated land and animate a second land on your turn to push 8 damage out of nowhere, keeping the Shoals engine running in the process. However, Shoals does ask for a certain degree of mana invested into abilities every turn to really maximize the value, so we'll see if Purifier ends up eating into the resource that Shoals is most dependent on too much. Shredding Dragon has received a small decrease to its casting cost from 6 mana to 5, and has otherwise been left unchanged. Honestly, this is a really exciting change to me, as 1 mana really does make a world of difference for this card's playability. While the typing of this permanent does make it more vulnerable than most creatures, a lot of the best artifact removal in the field right now is either targeted, locked to low mana values, or both, making this very likely to force an awkward ward trigger while pushing a significant amount of damage. If this doesn't get into main decks, I could see it at least sneaking into sideboards for Iviana Shells, where this can be used to punish token decks and mow down entire boards of 1/1s with ease. Sashanki Destiny's Chosen has received a stat boost as well, from 3/3 up to 4/4 to compensate for its tricky casting cost. Sashanki had already begun to see some play in a mid-rangey Prismatic Shell piloted by Red Pander's Bear to a 3-2 record in last month's GP, only to narrowly miss out on the top cut due to some rough final round matchups. Sashanki's boost here is representative of two increased damage rather than 1, actually, because her attack trigger allows her to pass her stats on to another creature, such as the similarly aggressive Quantum Leaper. If some form of multicolor Stompy deck can make the mana work, I think Sashanki still looks quite scary and looked better than ever. Glitch Chaos Redeemed also started to creep into last GP in the hands of Cool Beans on a more controlling Prismatic Mantle build. Their first ability is being changed to improve its stat setting from 4/4 to 5/5, as well as appending a card draw on combat damage clause to the buffed creature to help Glitch push the game to a close faster while keeping card flow up. I was already actually really impressed with how well their -3 could come up the board when spectating some of Beans' matches last month, and that ability leaving Glitch so vulnerable to a single point of damage is well mitigated by Prismatic Mantle, allowing you to replay them if your opponent ever chooses to take them out. With this buff, an unchecked Glitch is now more likely to run away with the game, which is another nice boon for Prismatic Mantle fans. Last of the Hyperpop cards being changed is Camille Triple A-Lister, another multicolor stompy creature that couldn't quite find a home previously. Her abilities have been shifted from caring about only herself to checking any of her creatures, with the attack clause looking for you attacking, and her combat damage clause checking your creatures, allowing her to benefit from both abilities the turn she comes down. This significantly improves how well she can snowball if left unchecked, and even on baseline means she'll often end her first turn as a 4/4 with a treasure in play. With a cheap evasive multicolor suite of creatures like Ignited Soul, a Prismatic Mantle Stompy deck seems poised to make a push in Hyperpop's final month of normal rotation tournament play. Moving on to Theros Age of Trax, we're starting off with the Army of Trax, whose cost is being changed to incorporate another white mana pip. This allows Army to, at a baseline, enter and create 3 Army tokens and put 3 counters on each and itself, where previously it would make 2 tokens and place 2 counters. For the record, that's a differential of going from 7 power for Army to be your only white devotion in play to 13. Pretty significant. It's always been poised to leverage effects that cheat creatures into play, and while there aren't too many options right now that are too potent for it, with Malfunctioning Portal with Scries being our best way to cheat it out from the library, and other than Sifting Through Soot, Reclaiming Ritual really being our only option for reanimation effects, a set with a solid reanimation option coming next rotation could really give this buff a chance to take over a game. Charging Brightmare received a slight buff, reducing the mana cost of its graveyard ability from 5 to 4. Brightmare is honestly already a decent card as is, not a truly remarkable body on the front, but a card with a solid ability from the graveyard and a good blessing to boot, so this seems well positioned to help any mid-rangey decks that would want to consider it. You'll probably hear me say this a couple more times, but this seems especially good with Kaineos Bladebound, who not only helps the Brightmare come into your hand more reliably, but wears the blessing like a champ. Haube's Familiar has had its flying-only blocking ability removed to allow it to better engage in creature combat on the ground. Frankly, while I think this buff is rather minuscule, it is a nice boon for a card that I already felt was decent for consideration. A cheap, scaling flying body is always going to be cause for some interest, and with its one drawback removed, Familiar could be another tool for blue tempo shells to give a look, though a sorcery speed creature will always have its timing issues as a bit of a problem. Caliphate the Mariner uh, that's not how you say that word. Calathi the Mariner has had her unblockable ability shifted to now let her slip by mana value 3 creatures, in the hopes of enhancing how reliable her combat damage ability can be at getting you a Blessing of the Sea. That being said, Caliphate still runs into issues against low mana value creatures with any semblance of a decent stat line, as well as being walled by tokens, leaving me feeling like overall she won't be too likely to see much of an uptick in play. Perhaps if folks really want more legendary permanents for their divine mishaps, but I think the chances are low. Nurture the Future has had its flash clause on Devotion to Black of 3 or greater changed to instead let it cost reduce the spell by 2 if that requirement is met. This is a huge boon for the card, making it one of the most potent, cheap card draw spells currently available in the field, especially in conjunction with Phoenix's Confidant, both of which love 1 mana black permanents to build devotion and keep card flow alive. I think Nurture the Future has a good shot to reshape how black decks, both mono black and black X, want to approach their card selection suite and just their spells they play in general. The last of our blessing creatures getting a rework, Furies of the Natural Order has had both sides changed. The front side has simply shed the lifelink for Menace, making it more liable to push through for damage and take creatures down if it becomes blocked. The blessing is far more simplistic than Tethered Reality was previously, making a static drain for 1 in your upkeep rather than having to track the life total changes of the enchanted player. Notably, Tether is also now a valid sideboard tool in matchups where you want to keep your opponent's life total from ever being able to stabilize. While I would say this is good against something like Sinido's -3, she's actually naturally good against auras anyhow by being able to shut off their enchant clause with her first ability, so we'll see if Furies and Tether start cropping up anywhere else. That being said, it's a good hit off of Kaineos. Perhaps the biggest buff in this patch, at least in my eyes, is to Menelaya Beloved Lyrist, whose mana cost and overall stat distribution have been slashed in half, and has had her protection ability reworked as well. While 6/6 worth of stats for 4 mana is nice on the surface, she ultimately proved to be a little too clunky, and her original protection ability being locked to a heroic trigger meant that she's struggled to ever really see that much successful play. As a 2-mana 1/1 that distributes 2 counters, she's much better positioned for Green Stompy, a well-performing deck from last GP that received no nerfs this month. On top of that, her protection ability being activated makes it easier to keep creatures safe over time in a deck so good at distributing buffs, while also providing some fun cross synergies, such as allowing you to strip counters from Zeno before putting those counters back on them to keep drawing cards. She's a... Oh, whoops, sorry, I skipped ahead. She's a solid card to draw in multiples, as her floor is a sorcery speed counter distribution spell in those cases. Her cost reduction and ability change make her a valid hit off of a Journey Begins and Contest Coordinators, and she can even work to remove detrimental counters such as stun counters from your creatures in a pinch. And hey, she's an enchantment to be found off of Kaineos. I suspect we'll see a good amount of Menelaya over the next few months, both in mono green and in green X creature-based decks. With Menelaya coming down in cost, brings another green rare up in cost to fill that void. King of Wilderness is gaining 2 green mana symbols in its cost up to 5 mana, in exchange for a stat increase, and it now coming with haste. King was already a decent card, only failing to make the cut due to how competitive mono green's 3-drop slot is, and while the 5-drop slot still has some competition in the form of Arasta's Handmaiden and Vasilisa Helping Hand, I think King of the Wilderness is best positioned to play into Green Stompy's strengths as a standalone threat capable of killing the opponent quickly if left unchecked. Another buff aimed at making blessings a bit better, Canopy of the Winter Nexus now allows you to cast a blessing from your graveyard as part of its attack trigger rather than excluding them. There are a few decent creatures with cheap blessings that I could see benefiting from this, such as Mogus's Raider and Oracle of Zakros, but I'm not really sure what the right home for this is. Ultimately, I think this is biggest as a buff for enchantment flickers like Brief Stop, where Canopy provides another avenue to get your cheap blessings back into play before flickering them to get their creature halves on the board. But even then, I can't say this will see a whole lot of use. Last for Theros is Iroas' Judgment, which is having its cost dropped by 1 in exchange for creating 1 fewer creature token. I'm not too confident in this change being super impactful, as it now rubs up against the curved topper slot that Ardor occupies, but the potential for Judgment to yield 3 hasty 2/2s on turn 4 while buffing any creatures you previously had in play is a solid ceiling to aim for. It just becomes a question of how heavily you need to bend towards mono red or mono white to meet the devotion count to choose 2 modes for Judgment on curve, and if all of that trouble is worth playing a card that's competing with Ardor on the curve. Closing out the buff talk with Awakening Uldoon, we start with another pretty exciting change. Recurring Visions is going down from 3 mana to 2. I've been on the fence of playing Visions in a few different shells, especially as Root Fossil has shown how strong having Repeat Surveils for 3 can really be. This is obviously a boon for any cheap flashback costs, such as All That Remains, Wave Through Spores, and Industrialize, but also has me thinking about flashback synergy cards such as Blistering Cryo Phoenix and Runehenge Pilgrim. It also now curves up into Aqua Crew Flagship, allowing the two blue graveyard engines to coexist rather than compete on curve. Permafrost Sentry is receiving an increase to its power and a decrease to its ability cost, to help it block better early on while being easier to set up as an additional ruin without eating into the mana you need to spell charge for a given turn. The card I'm most interested in leveraging this cheaper copy clause with is Aspect of the End, which gets scary in multiples and is far better to copy when Sentry's ability costs 2 instead of 4. Otherwise, its best use case may just be as a creature that can inevitably copy a land ruin, such as Haven of the Wild Ones, providing mana advantage after enough time spent going up the board. Rib Collector is receiving a pretty big buff here, now checking if a creature died this turn rather than if it wandered. Its base functionality remains the same, but you can now leverage your own creatures dying in combat, or your removal spells killing an opposing creature to get additional value when you cast it for the first time. There are some funky timing things, such as Rib Collector failing to trigger if it contributes the last needed point of devotion for Pull of Tizerus to make the first creature in a turn die, and Rib Collector being able to pick itself up from your graveyard if it enters with 0 toughness, as long as another creature's died in a turn. But for the most part, it's just an improved value creature. I was already somewhat interested in Rib Collector being able to spam the enter triggers of some cheap creatures, and now that it's better, big thumbs up all around from me. Gelthus Unspeakable Maw is shedding some of its stats in exchange for its spell charge condition being changed from 4 to 3, allowing it to animate the turn it's played and swing if you have a Tyrant's Remnants or another haste enabler in play. While this is a nice boost to the Black-Red Ruins deck after it suffered pretty severely to the nerf 2 Tyrant's Remnants, I think Ruins in general will still struggle with the added artifact hate we're getting in this patch. Bring Down the Sky is losing its alternate casting cost to instead pick up the ability to bring exiled cards you own with flashback to your graveyard, opening the door for increased recursion and value. The baseline here is using Bring Down the Sky to rebuy your flashback card selection spells like Industrialize and All That Remains. But there are some higher impact use cases, such as using Bring Down the Sky to rebuy a Chronicle of Extinction or Forget Their Names as well. I'm not certain what homes this shell could have, but a ramp deck being able to flash back a Chronicle and then sweep the board with Bring Down the Sky later to get the Chronicle back does seem appealing. Less appealing is the update to Galvanized Gargantuan, which is going from a 4/4 to a 5/5. Honestly, this seems like a really weak change to an already mediocre card. Paying twice a spell's cost for 2 copies of a spell is appealing on the surface, but it's not really worth it to run a 3-mana artifact for that in my eyes, when you could instead spend that mana on a Keranos to get a conditional 5/5 that makes your spells cheaper and kills your opponents while it's inanimate, or spend less mana on a Research Grant for both card selection and the ability to copy any spell rather than just instants and sorceries. Gargantuan's ability isn't awful if Progress's power is any indication, but at the same time, Research Grant has been a bit underplayed despite Progress being debatably stronger than Gargantuan, so it's hard for me to be too excited here. Another buff I'm not too optimistic about is Heartbonder, which is receiving an additional point of toughness to go up from a 1/1 to a 1/2. There are 2 big things holding Heartbonder back right now, in my opinion, with the first one being that Mono Green just has better scaling creatures right now. Seeker of New Horizons scales for no further mana investment as long as you keep playing basic lands, and Aspiring Anarchist only asks you to invest in other creatures to make it great, while Heartbonder needs you to spend a lot of extra mana in an aggro deck to make your 1-drop worthwhile. The other killer for me for Heartbonder is that the ability is a trigger conditional on you actually spending the mana, meaning you have to invest your mana to buff it before knowing if your opponent will actually let it resolve. Paying 2 mana alongside a 1-drop on turn 3 to make your Heartbonder a 3/4 becomes a lot more awkward when your opponent responds with removal, meaning you spend 3 mana on a 1-drop to get your previous 1-drop killed. The toughness boost is nice, but it doesn't solve the fundamental issues at the root of Heartbonder's lack of play. Mammoth Undertaking is a buff that does have a bit more merit to it, as shaving the mana cost in half makes this a potential card advantage buff spell a bit more interesting. If things align, this can turn a trade in combat into a kill, plus picking up a fetch land from your bin, which isn't too terrible, all things considered. I'm not sure what it's the most exciting thing to be doing with a combat trick right now, but it's an option at the very least. Last but not least, we have a pair of buffs to the Blades of Bright Futures and Clouded Pasts, each from 2 mana down to 1 to cast. Honestly, this is tough, as I think getting playable equipment into the field would be great, especially with the few equipment synergies we have right now, like Gut-Wrenched Martyr, just begging for something to be solidly main deckable. Unfortunately, though, I'm not confident these changes will do a whole lot as far as bolstering equipment strategies go. That being said, I do have to wonder if these new 1-mana artifacts could find some fringe play as more Cybersoul enablers. I'm not too optimistic, but being able to use Blade of Clouded Pasts as both a means of suiting up your Rooftop Slink so it gets in for more damage, and also as a way to help reduce the cost to flip it into Synthetic Spectre, which is a creature that's been proven to be fairly powerful even if you have to pay the full 4 mana to flip into it. Factor in that Blade of Clouded Pasts becomes a means of reach over time as you end turns with it equipped, and there could maybe be something to do here. In a pinch, maybe the Blade buffs could be the change Skarny Patrol needs to be worth trying out. Who knows? And that is a wrap on the March 2025 Revolution patch review and our first month 3 buff patch of Revolution. There are a lot of changes to adjust to in this field, so it's hard to say for certain what will succeed, but I do think some old reliables have gotten a lot of buffs, and a few big contenders have gotten through the patch relatively unscathed. I braced for a very aggressive field last month, and GP Whitecliff was overrun by controlling decks, so who knows what this month's GP will hold. In the meantime, if you're interested in playing the format and not already playing, please check out the links I mentioned in the description below. And until the start of the GP, rather, I'll see you all in the Revolution chat.